This is the Sic Em Podcast. The Sic Em Podcast is a production of Baylor Athletics. Now, here are your hosts, Brooke Bednarz and the voice of the Bears, John Morris.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Sic Em Podcast, a production of Baylor Athletics. We're glad you're with us. John Morris, Brooke Bednarz, and a very special Sic Em Podcast this week, Brooke, as we close out the 2021 calendar year. We are going to pay tribute to Mr. Dave Campbell, and I think it's appropriate to spend some time talking about Dave, remembering Dave, and everything he has meant to Baylor University and to Waco, Texas, and frankly to football fans around the state of Texas.
Absolutely. I think everyone knows Mr. Dave, at least the name. If they don't know the name, they know the magazine, and they know how much he meant. But specifically here at Baylor, since joining my time here at Baylor, I remember the first time I walked into a room and realized and made the connection that he was a Baylor Bear and just how special his name was here. Very excited to be able to remember him and pay tribute to him today and keep his legacy going on. Absolutely.
He'll be remembered forever as one of the all-time greats here at Baylor, one of the great journalists from the state of Texas. And to help us reminisce a bit about Mr. Dave is Jerry Hill, the Director of Sports Journalism for Baylor Athletics. Jerry, I know this is a topic that it's hard to talk about and maybe emotional to talk about, but I know you're glad to be able to talk about Mr. Dave.
Yeah, actually, and I think I may have mentioned that to Brooke. I think it's actually therapeutic for me. Yeah. Like I think it was 4 interviews on Monday about Dave, and I think it's helped, actually. I think it helps me kind of remember things and remember the good things, and so, yeah, I think it's actually helped me to talk about it.
Well, and one thing for myself, stepping into Baylor and kind of getting to meet you two and work alongside both of you, to hear about Frank Fallon and then to know that you kind of, followed in his footsteps now and you to have followed in the footsteps of Dave Campbell. I can't think of anyone better to be able to visit with today to celebrate his life.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, Dave was my first boss, graduated North Texas in 83, and he was basically my first boss. I worked on the news desk for a week or 2 weeks. I was promised the first sports job opening, and, actually the second day I was there, a guy left. But Dave, I still consider him my first boss.
Very good. And you talk about me following Frank and Jerry, you following Mr. Dave at the Trib and then here. They tell you not to follow a legend, right? And we just didn't do very well at that.
We didn't listen to what everybody told us, right?
We did not.
Yeah.
Think about this. There's something that I've been able to say over the last week or so. Think about Waco, Texas, and having a broadcaster the stature of Frank Fallon and a writer the stature of Dave Campbell here for all those years, for so many years, covering Baylor, covering the Southwest Conference into the Big 12. I mean, we were really blessed in those two areas.
Absolutely. And you think about a city, a town this size, having 2 guys like that and that stayed, that were loyal, that didn't. And, I'm sure both of them had chances. I know Dave had chances. I'm sure Frank had chances to go somewhere else. So for them to stay here and for us to be blessed, like you said, with that for so long. I mean, Dave was the sports editor for 40 years and another 15 years at the Baylor Bear Insider. So, yeah, I mean, we got to be around them. We got to share them for that many years.
When you think back at the early days of when you first started, is there maybe a story with one of the first articles you wrote, or do you remember something from the early times of your kind of first interactions with him as your editor?
Yeah. And I said in my column, he, as good a writer as he was, I think he might even be a better editor. Like he will go over everything with a fine-tooth comb. And it was specifically I was doing, and actually I started doing a little bit of that when I was still at North Texas, but I was doing some high school copy. So it's the little blurbs on each team that you'll see in the magazine. And I was doing some of that high school copy, and literally we typed it. And that tells you how long it's been. But we typed it, and I would, turn it in to him basically like, you would turn in a paper for school or something, and it came back, and it was absolutely covered in red ink. You could hardly see the rest of the words, but it made me become a better editor. It made me become a better writer, because it's like he is going to point out everything wrong. He's going to, it's attention to detail. That's the thing with Dave, is everything has to be just right. Hollis Biddle, who worked with him for all those years, was kind of his right-hand man, really, with the magazine, with the newspaper, and with Baylor Bear Insider. He said that literally when they first started, he wrote every bit of the high school copy for that first magazine in 1960. But he would look over every bit of copy that came into that magazine. So you think about, at that point, it was just 96 pages, but it grew to 400 pages.
I was about to say, let's think about these magazines.
Yes.
They're thick.
Yes. And so he would literally go over every line of copy in that magazine. So, yeah, that's his attention to detail, but that's him wanting to make that a special magazine, and he did, definitely.
Was Dave part of the reason you were fresh out of University of North Texas, then North Texas State?
Yes.
And was Dave part of the reason that you wanted to work at the Trib, or how much did that factor in?
Well, and again, I said I didn't get the sports job open. Well, there wasn't a sports job opening, but I was promised that. I can tell you, and this is kind of a little bit embarrassing, that because I didn't play football, I didn't really grow up reading and poring over Texas Football Magazine. Right. I really didn't. A lot of people did, and of course they would look for their name and stuff like that. I knew who Dave was. I knew who what the magazine was and everything. But, in terms of that being the attraction, no. But when I came and I interviewed, he was one of the ones I interviewed, and it was really a cool deal, because to get to know him, or, to sit down and have an interview with him, because I interviewed with him and with Dub Brown, who was the managing editor at the time, and, just the chance to meet him, and he did. He promised me the first sports job that came open, I guess he appreciated, my interest or whatever, and literally the second day, and I was racking my brain trying to remember what the guy's name was, and it was Roger Phillips, who actually went to the Kansas City Star, and he left on the second day, and I had to do my 2 weeks on the news desk, and Ernie Murray would not let me go until I was done with my 2 weeks.
That was a long 2 weeks, I bet.
That was a long well, as a matter of fact, it was funny, Brooke, because I think it was one of the first days that I was there, and I was still on the news desk, and John Werner had gone to Grand Junction, Colorado to cover MCC in the World Series, and he came back in, and he was, coming to introduce himself to me, and Ernie said, "No, you get away from him, he's mine." So,
that's great.
But, in hindsight, I'd like to say that that's the reason I came to Waco, but, I was applying at certain size newspapers, I guess. I think it was 30,000 circulation was what I was looking at that point and up. And Waco was actually one of the few that actually gave me a chance at that, or even an interview. I guess it was opportunity, that brought me to Waco. But man, what an opportunity to work with that guy. And he was, my sports editor for 10 years, and then obviously 15 years with the Bear Foundation.
In those 10 years, any special stories that ring a bell when you think back and reflect on that time after you were the newbie, when your papers were maybe a little less read?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that just it really resonates with me now is being able to travel with Dave, because he's the best storyteller that I've ever known, and just the chance to be on the road with him, and he would share his stories on the road, and as I got to know him better, he would share more stories, I guess, and a lot of times it did come back to the colorful characters that came through that newsroom in his in terms of when he first started 50 years at the Tribune Herald. So it always kind of came back to some of those guys. And like I said, best storyteller ever. And so those are the things I remember, those road trips with Dave, thinking that here I am, this 20-something sports writer, being able to travel with the founder of Texas Football Magazine, the sports editor of the Waco Trib, and this guy that just, he remembers everything. That's what always boggles the mind, is that he would remember details. Like I said, attention to detail. He would remember specific drives in a game. You know, for some of us, it's hard to remember a score. He would remember specifics about games that he went to or games that he covered.
Jerry, you've said, and I've heard you say several times, that he made us feel like equals.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And I think Frank was a lot of that same way, that they didn't have an air about them. You know, they didn't make you feel like, you know, I'm this guy.
Yeah.
So I think it was just the fact that he would again, I said in my column that, you know, I started to say that we trained at his feet, but we didn't. He let us walk alongside. He trained with us, and he let us, you know, be close to him. And it wasn't like we were training from the master. We got to be right there with him. And yeah, I mean, none of us were equals. And he made all of us. And I think that's why, you know, when you've seen all these different people write about him or, you know, talk about him, it's because of that relationship that they were able to have with him, either, you know, with the newspaper or with the magazine or whatever, because, yeah, he made you feel like you were, you know, maybe better than you were, but an equal with him, and you weren't. But, yeah, he just had a way about him to, you know, and I've seen him, you know, even interaction with, like, Lariat reporters and stuff like that, you know, he was very encouraging. You know, he could, you know, the guy that he is, the man that he is, he didn't have to do that, but he would always encourage those. And certainly, you know, when I was at the newspaper, he continually encouraged me and you know, would recognize if I wrote something good or something like that. He would always let me know. And, you know, maybe toward the end there was less red ink on those, on those critique sheets.
I remember the first time I met him in person. I'd seen him around, but actually had the opportunity to speak with him, and it was at the Texas Sports Hall of Fame, and he was signing magazines. And I was actually there as a sports reporter covering it for local TV. And I remember I put my camera down, and I got in line myself. And I was like, I want a signed magazine by Dave Campbell. Right. So I kind of took off my reporter hat and went through the line, and he had seen me getting footage of him. And one thing that I had reflected on while I was getting the footage is how much time, I mean, this line was long. And it was long because of the number of people there, but it was also long because the amount of time he was spending with every single person. Yeah. He didn't just want to sign it and move on. He wanted to know where you came from. Why were you buying this magazine? You know, had you bought more magazines? Is this your first? All of those things. And so when I got up there, it was the Jimbo Fisher cover. My brother was an Aggie, so I had to make sure I made sure and got that for him. And I got it all signed, one for my dad, one for me, and one for my brother. And I just remember going up there and getting these signed, and he was like, "Weren't you just filming?" And I was like, I was. And he goes, so then he wanted to know all about me and my career. And I was sitting there thinking, like, I was like flabbergasted, thinking, no, I want to know about your career.
That's him,
and it was just so special to be able to conversate with him. And that kind of, you know, my story kind of aligns with what you were just saying, of he made you feel like you were an equal and that he had known you forever. And so when I found out of his passing, the only thing I could think of to say was he just treated everyone like gold. And I don't know if you had a similar.
Well, and I was going to say, when you were talking about the signing deal, I guarantee you he didn't just sign it Dave Campbell.
No, he didn't.
He would put, you know, best wishes to the. Yeah, he would always include a note, and he wanted to know who he was signing it for.
Right.
It wasn't just, you know, so he wasn't going to just put his name. He was going to put their name. He was going to put some kind of note of encouragement or whatever. And that, again, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about, his attention to detail. You know, most people would just quick do a signature and stuff and be done with it, and let's move the line along. But Dave, like you said, would talk to you, but he also wanted to know who he was signing it for. He wanted to write a note to them.
Right. So he wanted to know that my brother was an Aggie and who my dad was, and, you know, getting to tell him that my brother would, like, hunt for these magazines and, you know, and then doing my job, starting in sports, local TV covering high school football. I was like, that thing had all of my notes for all of our teams. It was gold. We looked forward to getting it every year and tried to get it as early as possible so we could start studying. And one thing, when we talk about print, the Waco Tribune Herald and so many things have now turned digital, but that magazine is still printed. It's still a book that people go buy at the store. And I think that says so much. It's like his legacy is still printed and will continue to be, because that's what so many people across the state, now people know about Salina or Brownwood. Like, unless you were around those areas, people didn't know, or they didn't know how that team was. But now you sit around here and you can talk about Katy football and their coach Joseph. It's just crazy to think the impact that he had and that it's still printed. Yeah.
Founded the magazine in 1960. He actually sold it in 1985, but you better believe Dave Campbell's name is still on the cover.
Absolutely. It's Dave Campbell's Texas Football Magazine.
Right, which adds to the value of that and adds to people going to look for that magazine. Jerry Hill is our guest, reminiscing, paying tribute to Mr. Dave Campbell, who passed away last week at the age of 96. And he started Texas Football Magazine. I don't know how many people know. He started the Southwest Conference Press Tour also. You know that story. I mean, he and probably a small
it was a handful of guys, and they would actually go in cars. Yeah. Like I think him and Denny might have rode together on one of the very first ones. But they would literally just go in cars, and I remember him talking about, and he's written about it too, of going to Grand Junction when Texas A&M was there. And I mean, just he's so much a part of history because he has done stuff like that. But from the very start, that was just a way for them to get out and know the coaches and get out and know the teams and stuff. But he pretty much started that and did it right from the start. And and one thing I was going to say, when you were talking about him staying on as or his name is, for the longest time, as long as he could, he was still editing Texas Football Magazine. Wow. I mean, he was still very hands-on, and even in the later years, because I've seen some stuff that David Wetzel has, he was going to all those kickoff classic games and stuff and being a presence at those, and again, he would go and sign the magazine and stuff. I mean, this is into his 90s. Yeah. This guy was still that active and still, very involved, coming to the press conferences, doing all those things well into his 90s.
You mentioned coming to the press conferences. He did that. Last year was a COVID year, so everything was different. But so go back 2 years, 2019. Mr. Dave was there pretty much every Baylor football press conference. I know that. There was probably a lot of others that he was going to. But we all know that a press conference doesn't end until Mr. Dave says it ends.
It's like when Matt Rule was here, it was almost like he was waiting for it. Like he knew something was coming, so he wasn't going to leave until Dave asked a question. So Dave, like you said, came to every press conference, came to every home football game, went to pretty much all of the home women's basketball games, because that became certainly a passion later in life is following the women's basketball team. But I mean, he had to get that last, and you didn't know where he was going with it sometimes. Sometimes it was about recruiting, which, maybe he was trying to get a head start on the magazine. But, you just knew something was coming from Mr. Dave.
Well, and I think it's important if you're listening and you haven't been to a press conference ever, this is typically how they end. All the questions are asked. The coach kind of pauses. Yeah. There are no more questions asked because there's kind of a silence. Right. And then the sports information director at the time for Matt Rule was Taylor Bryan, now at North Texas. Right. And he would say, any more questions for Coach? Nope. All right. Thank you, Coach. And then the coach usually says, thank you all for being here, and walks off. So there's usually a procedure. And that whole procedure would happen, and Coach Rule would stay there. Yep. And then Mr. Dave would ask one or two or three questions. And everyone would stay. Yeah. There would not be a camera packed up. There would not be a soul that moved from that chair. And it was just so neat for me being new to Baylor for a little bit, kind of 2019 was right when I made that switch, to see that respect that he had earned, that was given, and that is not normal in college football press conferences. It is normally in and out and get it done. And so when I found out of his passing, I was telling my boyfriend and some friends that exact story of how Mr. Dave always got that last question. But let's also remember that he wasn't just coming to ask questions.
No,
he was
writing
writing
notes.
articles.
Oh, yeah.
He was writing notes in those press conferences, and first question in there, normally it's also quiet at press conferences when a coach walks in, and instead it was, "Did you get my game article?" That was the unofficial first question of every press conference he was at.
Oh, yeah.
Jerry, how about the gravitas of Dave and how much respect he had? Brooke mentioned it, by the media, by those around him here. But think about Coach Taff. And he and Coach Taff, worked together. Coach Taff's entire tenure here at Baylor. Yeah. But if I'm right in this, Coach Taff went to Dave to get his counsel more than once.
And I remember one of the times was when he, got the offer or there was interest in him from USC, and they actually drove around the stadium, and that was what Grant wanted to get his advice on whether he should take this job at USC. And you think about that, a head football coach, and at that point he had been here 8 or 9 years maybe, but wasn't the big name that he became. But he went to Dave for advice, and that respect. It wasn't just with the writers. It wasn't just with the people that wrote for him. It was pretty much everybody, and particularly the coaches. The coaches, I think, recognized what he had done, with Texas Football Magazine, also with the Waco paper for that many years, but specifically with Texas Football Magazine and what he did for high schools. Because that was the separator of Texas Football, is the separator of Texas Football Magazine. There's a lot of magazines out there that will cover colleges, that will cover pros. At that point, and even now, there's nobody that does it like Texas Football Magazine, that covers the high schools like he did. And I think that was important from him from the very beginning, is we need to do the high schools. And that's where that interest in everybody just kind of, swelled. But yeah, back to the coaches. I mean, I don't know of any coach that didn't have that kind of respect for Dave. And I can't remember exactly the story, Brooke, but I know there was, and it was kind of a press tour type deal, but he was at Arkansas, and Coach Broyles wasn't there, but he asked Dave if he would come to the house later. And so Dave went over there. And as it turned out, it was actually Frank Broyles' wedding anniversary, and he spent And he spent it with Mr. Campbell.
Oh, that's great!
But again,
that doesn't show the amount of respect he had.
Exactly,
honey.
And Darryl Royal was the same way. I mean, they were actually friends. They were close friends, and I think John might have mentioned this in a podcast that we did. But I don't know if you remember when we were down at UT. And they showed the picture. It's a living room, and it's Darryl Royal there. Willie Nelson a very young Willie Nelson is playing, and there is Dave and Reba sitting there listening to Willie Nelson with Darryl Royal.
You can't draw that up. No. What?
But that's the respect that man got from everybody.
I'm guessing there's no other sports writers in that room. But here's Dave and Reba. Both of them in there. That's really cool. He was a big tennis fan, big tennis man. Yeah. Played tennis as long as he could. He and Bernard Rappaport, I think, were
every day,
daily, right? Tennis. Now you were involved in one of these sort of maybe charity tennis events or
let's do charity. Let's don't do celebrity.
Celebrity is the right word. You're right. Celebrity tennis.
Celebrity. It might have been charity with how he played. Well, I'm just kidding. I can't play tennis, so I can't talk.
Well, and I will say, even from when I first came down to Waco, that was like one of the things I found out really quickly was how Dave's passion in tennis, and we would go out and play quite a bit, and it would a lot of times we would play doubles, and it would be like maybe me and John Werner or me and Kim Gorham versus John and Dave, and we played quite a bit. I mean, we played not every day like he did with Mr. Rappaport, but we played quite a bit, and I enjoyed tennis a lot, but never had the passion for it that he did. But yes, the one you were talking about, John, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. We couldn't let it go.
Yeah,
you know?
It was actually when Hurd Tennis Center opened up in 2001. And I don't remember who organized this, but we actually had a celebrity tennis match where it was me and Kevin Steele, the head football coach at the time, versus Dave and Kim Mulkey, obviously the women's basketball coach. And I can tell you exactly where all the fans, where their loyalties was, and it was not on our side. They loved them some Kim, and they loved them some Dave. Yeah. And I think I may have mentioned in there that I hit a winner right at Kim, and the fans actually booed. But when I was playing against Dave, and this is his competitive nature and stuff, he would hit a shot past me, or you do the little drop shot or whatever, and he'd say winner. And at the end of the match,
just to make sure you knew.
Yeah, at the end of the match, it's we win.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. It's a good memory.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, let's talk real quickly before we wrap up. He went to La Vega High School right here. He also attended Baylor, like we mentioned. But he, I believe, had to pause while because he was drafted into the military.
Right.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I will.
His career?
Yeah, and it's again, it's one of those things that he didn't talk about a lot. Like I said, Hollis Biddle was like his best friend, his right-hand man for all those years, and for the longest time, he had no idea about Dave's service in the Army, and specifically about him getting a Bronze Star medal. Mm-hmm. And that's not just handed out.
No,
so
it's not.
The fact that he fought in World War II in Germany and France, I think mainly. But he actually got a Bronze Star medal, and once he was done with the Army, I guess it was in 46, he came back and he started back at Baylor going to school. He had started in 42, and then when he turned 18, he got drafted and went over there and finished up. He tells me all the time that it's listed as 50, but he actually is, because they didn't have a winter graduation at that time. He actually finished in December of 49, and then his technical graduation date was 50. But he finished up in 49.
Well, and that also speaks to Dave and how fair he was to everyone. Everybody knew he was a Baylor grad.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But he was so well respected, again, among all the coaches in the Southwest Conference into the Big 12. Yep. I don't think that was ever a factor that he was from Baylor.
No, and I saw this like firsthand. Like and I would even take calls and stuff from people. A lot of people had no idea he was a Baylor grad, and that's because in his writing and stuff, he didn't show that.
Right.
Now, maybe when he was here, when he was actually working for Baylor, he could do that. But when he was working at the Waco Tribune-Herald, you would not know by his writing that was his team, that he was green and gold and all that. Like, I would have people ask, is he a UT guy? Is he an A&M guy? So that told you, how impartial he remained, even though you knew how much he loved Baylor. Because I sat with him at games, and I knew where his loyalties was, even before he came here. So.
Well, even his picks, the clouded crystal ball. I mean, he didn't pull punches.
No.
He wasn't a homer at all. I mean, if he thought Baylor was going to win that game, Brooke, he'd predict them on Fridays. He'd pick Baylor. If he didn't think Baylor was going to win, he wasn't picking Baylor. So he was very, very middle of the road there.
Well, funny note on that, and I think I don't remember if this was in my interview with him or maybe something from something else I had seen, but I think it was actually for the Sugar Bowl. They were taping something and they needed somebody to pick Baylor.
Wow.
And so they kind of made him pick Baylor, and he was right.
In 57.
Yeah, in 57, because they beat Tennessee. Tennessee was ranked like number 2 or something.
Right.
And Dave was not going to pick them.
Pick.
But kind of like made him pick Baylor.
Great.
I don't know if it was for a TV or radio show or what, but they like put him on the spot and wanted him to pick Baylor, and then he turned out he was right.
That's great.
Thank goodness.
Mr. Dave.
Yeah.
What about the legacy that he leaves behind? All you and all Bryce and all you writers. I mean, that is a long, distinguished list.
Yeah, it's amazing the guys that, and particularly if you throw the magazine in there too, but guys, even just the ones that came through the Waco Tribune-Herald in his 40 years as a sports editor and just in researching and stuff that I've written about him. I mean, Al Ward, he wound up being GM of the New York Jets. Just guys like that, and I'm drawing a blank on the name, but one guy went to Austin Statesman, Lou Maisel. Lou Maisel was the Austin sports editor. John McClain, obviously, the longtime NFL Houston Chronicle writer. A lot of people went to the Chronicle, and that was actually where our softball game started from, was all the Houston Chronicle guys that had worked for Waco Tribune-Herald. But everybody, and you've heard and seen this, like most of us, anytime he asked, we did it. And for most of us, and particularly with it being the magazine or whatever, we would have done it for free because Dave asked. If Dave asks you, and it's a little bit of the same way that Coach Rule was. Mm-hmm. If Dave is going to ask, I'm going to answer. Mm-hmm. My time is basically done. But if Dave Campbell is asking me something, I'm going to answer it. And I think that's the way with most of the people that worked with him and for him was, that's the respect we had for him, was that we would do anything for that man.
Well, I think when I was reading in the article, the long list of writers that, where they are now and the influence they're having on others, like Tony Peterson. He chairs the journalism department up at SMU. Just their impact that they're continuing to have on the future generations of writers. If this was a football broadcast, there would be a tree like Nick Saban, with his whole coaching tree, this is Dave Campbell's writing tree. And I think that that's important to be pointed out just because it's a different field, just as successful, just as impactful. Pretty neat to be able to celebrate.
Absolutely. And Dan Jenkins wrote for the magazine. Kevin Sherrington wrote for the magazine. David Castevens came through here. There was a columnist up in Dallas for a long time. So, his influence on sports journalism in this state, but really around the country, and certainly with the magazine, he's got his hand on a lot of things, and a lot of careers happened or were aided along by Dave Campbell.
Yeah, David Barron
picked
up the mantle.
And David was kind of his right-hand man a lot later in years.
Right.
But David, he actually worked at the Trib, but went to the Houston Chronicle as well, and but did a lot of the stuff for the magazine. He was kind of his high school editor for many, many years. So and the list goes on because there's been so many guys that have come through here and been influenced and just really respect the man. Yeah.
We talk about the writers, but we also need to talk about the athletes. Mm-hmm. He didn't coach football, but he had a huge part. I mean, when you look at the state of Texas, it's in the top 3 biggest states. There are a lot of high school football programs across this state. And to know that he wrote about all of them, had those kids' names in there. And then we talk about Texas high school football recruiting and the Texas High School Coaches Association and how big of a deal. I mean, we talked about that when Matt Rule came here, how he got those high school football coaches, David Wetzel, Sean Bell, et cetera, to come and to be a part of that because that's how big that is. And to know that he played a role in that, was very neat. Obviously, RG3 was very talented himself. Probably would have been noticed with or without the magazine. But he even took the time on national television to talk about Dave Campbell, to pause, to remember, because he had a huge part in opening the door for a lot of high school kids who probably maybe wouldn't have been recognized by a college if they had not been mentioned in that magazine.
And I know Bryce Petty had tweeted out, too, about that's still maybe one of the highlights of his career, his life, was being on the cover of Texas Football Magazine. Right. But, every kid that had his name in there, I mean, that was a big deal to them. Actually, got a text from my father-in-law, and he was, I don't even remember what year it was, but he remembers being in that magazine, and it was one of the very first ones that his name was mentioned, with his team. So that was a, and he still remembers it. How many ever years later? So that's a huge deal for any of those guys that just get their name mentioned, much less, some of them get their actual picture in there. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
What a legacy. What a legacy in so many ways.
Yep.
Mr. Dave passed away on December 10th at his home in Waco at the age of 96. Funeral service, a memorial service for Mr. Dave Campbell will be held at 11 a.m. on Friday, December 17th at Austin Avenue United Methodist Church in Waco. And that will be, we refer to these as a celebration of life.
Yeah,
that will be a celebration of a life well lived for Dave Campbell.
And it didn't click with me until later, but that he died the day after his wedding anniversary.
Oh, wow.
And Reba had passed it's coming up on 2 years. But, yeah, he died the day after his wedding anniversary, and they were married for over 70 years.
Yeah,
so
what a couple.
And do want to give our, thinking of to Julian and Becky, his 2 daughters, their husbands and 3 grandchildren. Darby lives here in Waco, and then his 2 grandsons. So we definitely thinking about them as well.
Thoughts and prayers for sure.
Yeah. Well, Jerry, thank you very much. We appreciate it. It is very fun to reminisce and remember the great Mr. Dave Campbell, and I don't use the term great lightly at all. What a legacy he leaves. Yeah. We are proud at Baylor University to have him as a Baylor alum and here in Waco, and all his time, 40 years, as the sports editor at the Waco Tribune-Herald. That is this week's Sic Em Podcast, thanks to Jerry Hill, the Director of Sports Journalism for Baylor University. For Brooke Bednarz, I'm John Morris. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. That's this week's Sic Em Podcast.
You've been listening to the Sic Em Podcast. The Sic Em Podcast has been a production of Baylor Athletics.